Gold standard. Okay, I know you're a big fan of going back to the gold standard. If we do decide to go back on the gold standard, how do we do that?
Well, we're going to go back on the gold standard eventually. You know, it's not going to be our decision. It's going to be the market's decision. I think the world is likely to go on the gold standard before we do, even though we still supposedly have a lot of gold, because the US dollar is now the world reserve currency. Before the dollar was the reserve currency, gold was the monetary reserve, right? And we changed that, in Bretton Woods. But the reason we were able to get the world to follow us onto the dollar standard was because at the time, the US was the world's richest creditor nation. We had massive trade surpluses, or a big creditor nation, and we had all the gold. We had all the factories. We were the big producer of manufactured goods, low-cost producer of everything manufactured was made in America. So we had a powerful economy, a real wealthy economy, and the dollar was not only backed by gold, but it was convertible into gold. Americans couldn't convert it anymore thanks to FDR, but foreigners, if you had $35 Federal Reserve notes, you would get an ounce of gold. And so what we told all the central banks around the world was, hey, back your currencies with dollars instead of gold, because the dollar is as good as gold, because $35 are 1 ounce of gold. But the difference is, if you have $35, you can buy a US Treasury and earn interest, right? But still have a gold standard, because we got your gold at Fort Knox. And so the world made that deal with us. But of course, once they made that deal, we exploited it, because now all of a sudden we convinced the world to hold treasuries as reserves, to loan the US government money so we could spend more. But what really happened during the 1960s is we abused that. We really started running big deficits because we didn't have to have the gold anymore. We can just print money, and everybody was holding on to it. So we had the Great Society, the War on Poverty, Vietnam, the Moon Mission. We had the guns and butter. And we printed all this money. And then we started, our creditors got smart. De Gaulle and France in particular wanted his gold. It's just bullshit. You don't have any, and in fact, prices really started to go up because of all the money we were printing, but the price of gold wasn't going up. All the other prices were going up. And so it was clear that gold was undervalued. And so the world wanted their money. And then we went off the gold standard. Instead of doing the right thing, which would be to devalue the dollar officially to a point that the gold price would make sense, or to allow deflation so that prices would come down back in line with a $35 gold price, we did the worst thing possible. We went off the gold standard, and the price of gold went up to 850. We had all the inflation of the 1970s. We really, had a terrible decade. But even though the dollar got marked down dramatically, it lost 2/3 of its value against the Swiss franc, the D-mark, the yen. The dollar continued to function as the reserve currency, despite the fact that it was backed by nothing, right? Now, once that happened, we really abused that. Then we started running massive deficits because we didn't have to have any gold, and everybody knew that we didn't have any gold. And we just kept printing money, and then we developed this completely phony economy, this service sector economy that was based on the ability to print money and just send it abroad. And the world sent us all their stuff that we didn't have to produce. And now no one had to save anything because we could just rely on the foreign savings. But when the dollar crashes, and it's going to, because this system has screwed up the entire global economy, then the world is not just going to anoint some other currency as the king, right? We're not going to have the euro as the reserve currency, or the yen, or the Chinese RMB, none of that. Right? We're just going to go back to gold. Gold works as money, and gold is a viable reserve for currency. And that's why a lot of central banks still hold gold. And that's why central banks have been buying gold, is because they are preparing for a return to a gold-based monetary system that works, instead of this fiat system that doesn't, but that principally benefits the United States. The United States benefited because we were the monopolists in the creating of the dollar. We got to print them, and so we got this extraordinary privilege. But in the process, we have hollowed out our economy. So when we lose that privilege, we're going to have a huge price to pay. We are very vulnerable because of, of this system. But in the long run, I mean, we'll benefit too from a return to the gold standard. But that's what's going to happen. And so, the way you go back to a gold standard is you simply announce, right, that your currency is now tied to gold at a particular rate. And obviously that rate is going to be a function of how much gold you have and how much currency is in circulation. But obviously the gold price for the US to return to a gold standard at this point, I don't know if it's 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. I don't know where we have to fix the price of gold to make it work in dollars, but we can do it. But then once you get on a gold standard, you got to stay on a gold standard. That means the budget has to be balanced. That means trade has to be balanced, right? We can't run these big budget deficits. We can't run these big trade deficits. So now all of a sudden, gold is going to force fiscal responsibility on our elected officials, which is what they don't want. That is the opposition. That is why government doesn't want the gold standard, because they don't want that kind of restraint. It's like, you know, dude, if you're at a high school prom, did the kids want the chaperones there? Of course not. They don't want the chaperones there. They want to have fun. They don't want the chaperones. And so the politicians don't want chaperones at their prom. They don't want gold ruining their party. They want to be Santa Claus. They want to promise something for nothing. When you're on a gold standard, you can't print gold. It has to be mined out of the ground, right?
So then the question becomes, to go back to gold standard, the history of it. If you can help me out with this part here, I think it was what? FDR went on gold standard. He asked people to bring back the gold, and they were, confiscating
No.
gold.
We were
the history of it.
Well, we were on a gold standard from the Constitution. And in fact, the Constitution established both gold and silver as money. So we're on a bimetallic standard, right? So the dollar was actually defined as a weight of gold or silver. That was the definition of a dollar, right? It's a measurement of how much gold or silver that you have, right? And that's where it came from. And it was named from the Spanish mill dollar, which was a coin that was circulating around the time of the Revolution. And in fact, during the Revolution, we did have paper money, right? The government issued continental money that was actually backed by gold, but they issued too much of it, and it ended up collapsing, and people got 10 cents on the dollar, and it gave way to the expression "not worth a continental," which is one of the reasons that the founding fathers, when they established the United States, did not want paper money. And so they specifically banned it. If you understand how the Constitution is written, you'll see that paper money is illegal in the United States. They said gold and silver are legal tender. They said no state can make anything other than gold and silver legal tender. And the only power they gave to Congress was the power to coin money, which is gold and silver. They didn't give Congress the power to emit bills of credit, which is paper money, and they denied that power to the states. So there was no paper money. And we had no paper money at all in the United States until the Civil War, right? So we went until 1961, right, without any paper money. So if paper money was constitutional, we would have had it before 1861. So we got paper money in 1861, and it was backed by gold. The greenbacks that were issued were backed by gold. And they challenged it. There were several Supreme Court cases because people said, hey, this is unconstitutional. You can't print money even if it's backed by gold. And if you read some of these Supreme Court decisions, the reason they said it was constitutional was not because of the monetary powers that were given to Congress. Everybody knew that they had no power to print money. They looked to the necessary and proper clause and said we were in a civil war. It was an emergency. And so it was an emergency wartime power. If the government could requisition goods in a war, they could requisition goods and give you a paper IOU. So it was because it was a war and there was an emergency that we were able to issue the paper money backed by gold. And then what happened was after the war ended, they stopped doing it. So the paper money didn't even come back until the Federal Reserve brought it back in 1913, right? And we were still on a gold standard. As I said, Federal Reserve notes had to be backed by real money. In fact, Federal Reserve notes were not dollars. Federal Reserve notes were IOUs for dollars. The dollars were the gold that the Federal Reserve had, a coin, right? That's $1. An ounce of gold is $1, right? A $20 gold piece, about an ounce of gold, is $20. The dollar is the gold and silver. The piece of paper, the Federal Reserve note, which is why it's called a note, it's a note because it pays the bearer dollars, the real money. The notes aren't the money. The gold and silver was the money. So we were still on a gold standard. And then what happened is when the Depression hit, right, stock market crashed, and Hoover made all his mistakes Hoover was like the George Bush of his day with big bailouts and stimulus, his own version. to turn that downturn into what became the Great Depression. Had we handled the 1929 downturn the way we handled the 1920 downturn, had we done nothing, had we just cut government spending and let the free market work, there never would have been a depression and we never would have elected Roosevelt. But because Hoover intervened for political reasons and made the situation worse, we ended up with Hoover. And believe it or not, Roosevelt campaigned against Hoover by campaigning against the deficits that he ran, the big deficits, and saying, he's intervening too much. He was like Trump. He kind of ran criticizing the big government policies of Hoover, but then when he won, he adopted the entire agenda with the New Deal and made it even worse. But one of the things that Roosevelt wanted to do was he wanted to increase government spending, and the gold standard stood in the way. So rather than just abandoning the gold standard, he said it's illegal to own gold. Everybody has to turn in their gold, right? So everybody turned in their gold, or not everybody, but a lot of people. And the government gave everybody $25, right, for an ounce. And then as soon as Roosevelt got everybody's gold, he devalued the dollar and said, now you need $35 to buy an ounce of gold. So that's how they took all that money, because they had to devalue the dollar, but they wanted to get all the gold first, right? And then they used that to fund a lot of the government programs. But we stayed on a gold standard. Even though we devalued the dollar, we stayed on the gold standard, and it was illegal still to own gold, because the government, in order to get everybody's gold, they had to make it illegal to own it. And it stayed illegal to own gold until the 1970s. It was illegal to own it. But even when the government made it legal again, and you could always own gold jewelry, you just couldn't own it in a monetary form. You can have a necklace made of gold, you can have silverware, made of gold, but you just couldn't have a bar of bullion or a coin. But certain collectors' coins you were allowed to have, right? They couldn't take your coin collection. But what happened was, when they made it legal again to own gold, it wasn't remonetized, because now we were totally off the gold standard. We didn't leave the gold standard completely until 1971, when Nixon, said that's it. But the reason we went off the gold standard was because Nixon had a choice: cut government spending, right, or sever the link to gold, because we were reaching the point where we could not do it anymore. We were going to have to act responsibly, right, or to continue to be reckless. But the only way to do that was to get off the gold standard. But the politicians want to pretend that, the gold standard is bad. The gold standard is good. They say, if we're on a gold standard, we can't stimulate the economy in a recession. Exactly, because the stimulus doesn't work. It's actually a sedative. The government causes the recessions with the policies that it uses to get us out of the last recession. And instead of allowing the free market to cure the economy, government intervention makes it sicker.
So if somebody does believe that we're going to go back on gold standard, would this be a good time to buy gold?
Absolutely. Look, we can't go back on a gold standard at the current price of gold. The price of gold is going to have to be much higher.
Why is that?
It is today.
Why is that?
But because look at all the money that's in circulation. I mean, look, the other way to do it is if the price of everything else goes down. So if we allow complete deflation, if we allow prices to collapse and gold stays the same, then it can still work. But it has to do with relative. And in deflation, the government would destroy a lot of the money that's in circulation. So we can go back to a gold standard through massive deflation. I just don't think that's politically expedient. I think the easiest way to go back to a gold standard is just to revalue the one price of gold up to match everything else. But either way, if you own gold, you win either way, right? If the price of gold goes up, way up, then you have more purchasing power. If the price of gold stays the same and real estate crashes, stocks crash, then you still have more purchasing power. Right? You can still buy more stuff with your gold. So regardless of how we go back to a gold standard, if you have more gold now, you are the winner, right? The central banks that are adding to their gold holdings now, their nations will be winners, right? It's the central banks that were dumb enough to sell their gold that still haven't bought any back. Those are the ridiculously foolish decisions.